Hi, welcome to Dead Air Live. My name's Laurel Greenberg, and tonight's show is called Space Wars. We're going to be discussing the possibility, and more likely the probability, that in the future the nations of the world may be fighting wars from space. This September, the U.S. military will be launching a new satellite called Warfighter 1, which will employ a very powerful camera that will be able to tell the difference between a tree and a tank. Also this fall, they're going to be launching the first microsatellite. And remember Star Wars from the early 80s that President Reagan tried to employ? Well, President Bush is going to be reviving that program. A couple weeks ago, the New York Times Magazine cover story was called The Coming Space War. So this is a very hot topic in the news. And we're going to be discussing that article as well as a new video called Star Wars Returns. My guests in the studio tonight, to my left, is Lisbeth Grunland from the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's a physicist here in Cambridge. Thank you for coming, Lisbeth.
Thank you for having me.
And my other guest is Andrew Lawler, who's the Boston correspondent for Science Magazine. To start off with, let me just ask you both where you stand on this issue and what do you think about all this?
Well, I don't think it's quite as inevitable as perhaps the military would want us to believe, namely war in space. And I think, in fact, there has been a sort of de facto international norm against both putting weapons in space and developing weapons on the ground that could shoot down satellites. And I think that that is something that there is a lot of interest around the world in other countries, not right now in the US government, but in turning that into more of a legal framework where you would basically cut off this avenue of war fighting. And I think that would be a very good thing, not just for the rest of the world, but for the United States. Because the United States, more than any other country, depends on satellites, not just for its military in terms of detecting things on the ground, but also for commercial enterprises. So it would be a very bad idea for the U.S. to lead the charge into weapons in space. We would have the most to lose.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, what about you? Thoughts about this?
I think there's an important distinction to make between militarization of space and the weaponization of space. Space has been militarized for 40 years, ever since the first spy satellites were launched by the United States and the Soviet Union, and they've served a very good purpose. They allowed both sides during the tough days of the Cold War to know what the other had, and that kept the peace. So the militarization of space, in that sense, I think has been a great step for humanity. When you talk about weaponization of space, it's a completely different area. You're talking about putting weapons in space or weapons that could knock out satellites in space, and that would be akin to poking out somebody's eyes. If you're trying to find out what your enemy is doing and suddenly you're blinded, then what is your reaction going to be? Maybe launch a few nuclear missiles because you don't know, just to be safe. So to introduce weapons into space is a completely different issue, which I think we need to keep separate, because I don't think it's a bad thing for the military to be in space. It has kept the peace, particularly through spy satellites. But when you're talking about weapons that could actually destroy satellites, then I think you're talking about really potentially changing the balance of power and creating a very different kind of regime.
Well, the article in the New York Times, I mean, I'd like to get your comments on that, but it seems to suggest that that is the direction that the U.S. military would like to go in, that they think that we need to weaponize space before somebody else does.
Right. I think just before President Bush took office, there was a panel led by soon-to-become Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, which looked at all these space issues and basically concluded that war in space was inevitable, and hence the U.S. should get there first. And I think that assumption is fundamentally wrong. But if you start with that assumption, then you are kind of led in that direction. Why get there second if we have the technical capability to get there first and lead the way, and perhaps gain an advantage in doing so, rather than trying to prevent this whole development. So I think you're right. I think that is their working assumption, and they're very interested in developing weapons in space, and part of their missile defense plans include that possibility. And they're also interested in developing the capability of shooting down satellites that other countries have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm very curious, and hopefully we can get to discuss this throughout the show, but how we can change that and how we can avoid that. I want to read one thing that was put in this article about something called a laser cannon, and this was quoted from a study on I guess using such a laser from space. A full power beam can successfully attack ground or airborne targets by melting or cracking cockpit canopies, burning through control cables, exploding fuel tanks, melting or burning sensor assemblies and antenna arrays, exploding or melting munitions pods, destroying ground communications and power grids, and melting or burning a large variety of strategic targets, all in a fraction of a second.
Well, the one thing they don't tell you is that this laser doesn't exist, and it's if there were a laser that had that capability, it's currently too big to get up into space. I mean, so part of the problem, I think, with that article is it blurred things that are, in fact, current technology and things that are, off in the future.
Okay.
And that's something that's off in the future.
So these reports that are done in this there's a bunch of people in like think tanks dreaming up these toys for the military that.
Well, and there are people doing research and development on that technology, but they're nowhere near able to launch something like that into space and get it. I'm sure there are people who would love to, but technically they aren't capable of doing that.
But I would add that while that's true, I think that the people in charge now really do believe that space is an important arena, and this has not been the case before. The Air Force, Navy, and Army in the past haven't really cared a whole lot about space, less the Air Force, but the other two services haven't. Now the people running the Defense Department really believe that space is important, which can be good for putting up better spy satellites, which is talked about in that article, but which also you could enter this area where you're putting up small satellites which could hurt or bump or explode and destroy other satellites.
And that's when you cross over. Satellites.
That's when you cross over that line into space weaponization.
Okay.
So I think the people that are in charge now are seeing those two as joined, and I think the challenge is for Congress and for the public is to decide whether or not those should be joined or whether they should be considered separately.
Well, this topic has obviously become the interest of many people around the country, and journalists and concerned citizens. I'd like to show our viewers a tape that was made by Enviro Video out of New York, and we'll watch the tape and then we can come back and discuss what they say in the tape. This tape is called Star Wars Returns. Let's go to the tape.
The United States is seeking to make space a new arena of war. U.S. military documents speak of having the U.S. control space and from space dominate the Earth below. The U.S. military wants to base weapons in space. And now with George W. Bush and Richard Cheney in power, the country has an administration intimately linked to the corporate and arch-conservative interests which, with the U.S. military, have been seeking to turn space into a war zone. Star Wars is back, and there's only a narrow window to stop the U.S. plans from going forward and preventing what inevitably would follow. Other nations meeting the U.S. in kind and an arms race and ultimately war in space. And there's only a narrow window to strengthen the Outer Space Treaty, the landmark 1967 international treaty that seeks to keep war out of space, that sets aside space for peaceful purposes. The U.S. space warfare plans are explicitly laid out in documents, including the Vision for 2020 report of the U.S. Space Command, which was set up to coordinate U.S. space warfare activities. Here's the report, which features a laser weapon firing a beam down from space, zapping a target on Earth. Vision for 2020 starts out, U.S. Space Command dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interest and investment, integrating space forces into warfighting capabilities across the full spectrum of conflict. The model? The U.S. Space Command compares the U.S. effort to control space and the Earth below to how centuries ago nations built navies to protect and enhance their commercial interests, how the great empires of Europe ruled the waves and thus the world.
U.S. policy at every front, certainly the congressional front, and more importantly, the executive front, say quite explicitly that it is our moral right and our duty to use unilateral control as often as possible. And to that extent, I think one has to say that you can't blame the Space Command or the directors of the intelligence agencies because they are merely doing what our civilian leadership wants them to do in a very expressed nature. Now, the civilian leadership on their front can say, really, our entire culture expects a winner-take-all attitude toward space domination and planetary domination.
The blueprint for the space military program of the Bush-Cheney administration is this document, issued in early 2001, the report of the Space Commission chaired by the new Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. In the coming period, states the report, the U.S. will conduct operations to, from, in, and through space in support of its national interests, both on the Earth and in space. The report urges the U.S. President have the option to deploy weapons in space. It stresses the projection of power through and from space in response to events anywhere in the world. The Rumsfeld Space Commission recommends a transition of the U.S. Space Command to a Space Corps, a quasi-independent military arm like the Marine Corps. The Rumsfeld Space Commission was set up by legislation authored by Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire. Smith says of U.S. control of space,
it is our manifest destiny. You know, we went from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States of America, settling a continent, and they call that manifest destiny. Well, now the next continent, if you will, the next frontier is space, and it goes on forever. The assets are unlimited.
Everyone in the civilian community, as well as the intelligence agency and Space Command leadership, honestly believe that the United States deserved the fruits, so to speak, of winning the Cold War, and that we are in a position now where the United States is the only one, in their eyes, that has the right to claim sole ownership of space, and are not about to let others impinge upon space in a way that would threaten U.S. national security interests. The problem is that these leaders in the United States government believe they are the only ones who have the right to say what use of space is right and wrong.
Vision for 2020 stresses the global economy, of which the U.S. is the engine. Says the U.S. Space Command, the globalization of the world economy will also continue with a widening between haves and have-nots. The view is that by controlling space and the Earth below, the U.S. will be able to keep those have-nots in line. The U.S. military not only acknowledges, it proudly points to U.S. corporations being involved in helping set U.S. space military doctrine.
The documents that have come out of the Space Command over the last few years have talked about a power reach far beyond the borders, the physical borders of the United States. And in their own rationale for their extension of power, they talk about the need to protect United States interests and investments worldwide. They're not talking about defending our own towns and villages from an invader. They're talking about protecting this huge globalization dynamic that is more or less a new form of colonization for the rest of the world. It's a little bit like the cavalry following the original settlers. that finally, if you are taking something that there is conflict about, you have to have the cavalry. And the cavalry to this new power reach and power grab is increasingly the space forces of the United States.
But I always knew the military force is the only way the markets can work. It's like the British. It's like the British brought their warships. It's like the Gulf War, controlling the oil, but that the marketplace has been turned into a battlefield. And I think it should be stopped. I think it is insane. And we cannot afford to have a handful of politicians and military people respond to the world from a position of deep fear and deep panic. Because this kind of violence only comes from fear. And we cannot afford the kind of violence they're getting ready to unleash on the world because of their ignorance and their fear. Because if they were not ignorant about how people live, they would not be threatened by ordinary people living on their 1 acre patch of land, managing to defend biodiversity and look after future generations. That's all people, most people in the world want, a little peace for themselves and the future. And that little dream of peace is being annihilated. And I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's fair.
With the Bush-Cheney takeover, the U.S. has an administration thoroughly gung-ho for Star Wars. It's loaded with figures intimately linked to the corporate and arch-conservative interests that have, with the U.S. military, been pushing for space warfare. Vice President Cheney himself was a member of the board of TRW, his wife Lynn a board member of Lockheed Martin, both major Star Wars contractors. In the Bush choice of Donald Rumsfeld as U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. got a man whom the Washington Post called the leading proponent not only of national missile defenses, but also of U.S. efforts to take control of outer space. The U.S. Space Command's long-range plan starts out by stating it's been the U.S. Space Command's #1 priority, and the development and production process by design involved hundreds of people, including about 75 corporations. It lists the corporations, beginning with Aerojet and going through Boeing, Hughes Space, Lockheed Martin, Rand Corp, Raytheon, Sparta Corp, TRW to Vista Technologies. President Dwight Eisenhower warned in his farewell address to the nation in 1961 of the rise of a military-industrial complex. Now is the time, says the long-range plan, to begin developing space capabilities. Space power in the 21st century looks similar to previous military revolutions, such as aircraft carrier warfare and blitzkrieg. Says Guardians of the High Frontier, an Air Force Space Command report, space is the ultimate high ground. Master of Space is a motto of the Air Force Space Command. Master of Space appears as a Space Command uniform patch and is emblazoned on the front entrance of a major Space Command element, the 50th Space Wing in Colorado. Master of Space, that pretty well sums up the U.S. military attitude towards space.
Well, the whole idea of one country deciding that they're going to be the master of space, or the Ubermeister of the world, if you will, is, I think, a violation, #1, of international law, the Outer Space Treaty that says the heavens are the province of all humankind. The whole notion that one country will militarily control the world, I think, is extremely destabilizing and is a threat to international peace and security. The only way we're going to truly have peace in this world is to sit down, negotiate treaties, honor treaties. And the fact that the United States wants to go forward and violate the anti-ballistic missile treaty that we negotiated with Russia in 1972 is an indication that we're heading in the opposite direction.
I would hate the idea of anyone wanting to dominate the world. I mean, we tried it, or the Germans tried it during the Nazi time, and the world didn't really like it. I don't think we need a policeman up in space controlling all the world, but we should work on an equal level and on a cooperative level to sort things out and to use space peacefully, certainly, but not use it for military purposes at all.
What we're talking about here is the fact that the United States military wants to be the policeman not just of the world, but the policeman of outer space as well. Some people say, what's wrong with that? We're the good guys. We're John Wayne. What's wrong with having us in outer space be the top cop on the block? Because it'll destabilize the entire balance of power. The Chinese have already stated that they will pierce and overwhelm a Star Wars program which is only effective against 20 missiles. And 20 missiles is all the Chinese have. And the Chinese have stated that they think the Star Wars program is directed against them, and they will pierce and penetrate a Star Wars shield. Then the Indians have stated that if the Chinese are going to increase their nuclear arsenal, then they have to, as a question of national pride and security, increase their nuclear arsenal as well. And then the Pakistanis have stated that if the Indians increase their arsenal, they have no choice but to increase the number of weapons in their arsenal. And so the question we have to ask is, do you feel more secure knowing that a Star Wars program which may not work will instigate a new arms race with the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Pakistanis openly stating that they cannot let the United States be the top cop on the block?
Far more than reports and rhetoric are involved. Now underway is the Space-Based Laser Demonstrator Project, a development program for this project, which the U.S. military says has a life cycle budget of $20 to $30 billion, has begun. Here's a promotional poster showing the laser firing its ray in space while a U.S. flag somehow manages to wave in space above it. Boeing and Lockheed Martin and TRW are partners in this laser. A second space-based laser already test-fired more than 20 times is the Alpha high-energy laser built by TRW.
The rest of the world perceives Star Wars as a first strike system. The Russians, the Chinese, they're not stupid. If the United States comes out with a bulletproof vest to protect itself, it means the United States can fire from behind the bulletproof vest with impunity. So where's it going to end? This was supposed to be a defensive shield, a shield for peace. Now we know that it's really a first strike weapon system for world domination, and it's also something that is sparking a new arms race as the Russians, the Chinese, and now the Indians say that they want to build a system that will pierce, penetrate, underfly, overfly, and overwhelm and fool a Star Wars program.
Some $6 billion plus funds in the black being spent secretly have been going into U.S. space military activities annually. In recent years, what Ronald Reagan in 1983 called the Strategic Defense Initiative has been renamed National Missile Defense. In the fuller picture, what is sought is largely offensive. Indeed, U.S. military documents consistently describe missile defense as just one layer in a broad U.S. program of space warfare.
What the United States should do, instead of arming the heavens, instead of deploying nuclear weapons and the latest weaponry in outer space, is to begin the process of demilitarization on the planet Earth, to sign treaties to resolve political conflicts without expensive military hardware, because that only increases the escalation of a new round in the arms race. It's much cheaper and ultimately politically wiser to begin the process of negotiations rather than the militarization of space.
Well aware of U.S. space warfare plans, other nations of the world arranged for a vote in the United Nations General Assembly on November 20th, 2000 to reaffirm the Outer Space Treaty and specifically its provision that space be reserved for peaceful uses. Some 163 nations voted for the resolution titled Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. It declared that the use of space shall be for peaceful purposes, carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. The U.S. abstained. Ironically, it was the U.S. that was deeply involved in initiating the Outer Space Treaty. Craig Eisenrath was in the U.S. State Department at that time and central to drafting the treaty.
In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. In early '58, the United States responded, and the space race was on. And it became very clear that there were a number of major issues that had to be solved quickly. One of them was, who owns outer space? You had to solve the issue who actually owned it. Another issue had to be, what happens to astronauts or space vehicles if they come down on somebody else's territory? Another very serious question was, where is outer space? Where does it start? Where does it end? A much more serious issue was, how are you going to keep outer space out of the arms race? And so a number of people in the State Department, particularly in the legal office and in the political section where I was working, began working on an outer space treaty. In 1963, there was a UN agreement, a General Assembly agreement, which dealt with some of these aspects. And then in '67, that agreement was extended to restrict the militarization of space. The intent was to keep space out of the arms race, to keep it free of weapons, no weapons of mass destruction, and no using of space as another theater for military operations.
The final wording of the treaty prohibits nations from placing nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in space. To clear up any confusion and specifically bar any weapons in space, both Canada and China have been active at the UN in seeking to bolster the Outer Space Treaty with an agreement to ban all weapons in space. And Eisenrath says what the U.S. is up to now is a violation of the treaty.
The putting of lasers, I think the putting of guidance systems in outer space, certainly the putting of any kind of warhead in outer space is totally against the intent of the treaty. And I think what we are now is on a path by which we're going to subvert the treaty. Interestingly enough, the current administration is trying to get out of these kinds of restrictions. Look at the policy, for instance, for the ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty is now called a relic of the Cold War. And you're going to see each one of the major arms control agreements put in that context, because what the current administration wants is unilateralism. That is, the right to do whatever we want, when we want to do it, without the restrictions of international agreements.
I mean, that treaty is ancient history.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld is Mr. Star Wars. He has staked his entire professional reputation on building a Star Wars system. But the problem is, Rumsfeld and Bush and Cheney are in too deep. They are too close to Lockheed Martin. They're too close to the weapons manufacturers. They need a Star Wars system to keep the profits going and to command the high ground of outer space.
If we're going to get into space, we shouldn't be worried about a treaty or somebody hurting somebody's feelings. I think as Secretary Rumsfeld just came back from Europe and he met with many of the European leaders, and he basically said, look, if a missile defense or assets in space are in the national security interest of the United States, we're going to do it. We're going to protect ourselves. And hopefully you guys will join us, but if not, we need to move forward.
Worst of all, with this intention to go ahead with a national missile defense program, is it is only the tip of the iceberg. It is really an excuse to put U.S. weapons in space. This is nothing more than a threat to make space a new battleground which the United States will dominate and render the rest of the world subject to our dominion from space. And all we will have started by putting weapons into space is to ensure that other nations in the years ahead will make their own space warfare efforts, and we will have succeeded in increasing the danger to the United States of America and its citizens.
The U.S. military sees nuclear power systems orbiting in space as necessary to power weapons in space.
In outer space, there are no extension cords. Therefore, the military has experimented with a number of methods to get unlimited power to energize their space-based systems. RTGs, for example, will give you a limited amount of electricity with plutonium. But the military would really like to go to full-blown nuclear reactors in outer space. If you have a laser beam based in outer space or a particle beam weapon, you have to supply large quantities of electrical power to energize the system. And the only known way of getting such fabulous amounts of cheap portable power is with nuclear power plants in outer space.
As the U.S. Air Force Board report, New World Vistas Air and Space Power for the 21st Century states, a natural technology to enable high power is nuclear power in space. Setting the emotional issues of nuclear power aside, this technology offers a viable alternative for large amounts of power in space. Indeed, a key reason why NASA insists on using nuclear power in space is its desire to coordinate its activities with the U.S. military.
We sometimes forget that NASA and the Pentagon are very close when it comes to funding. For example, in the initial stages, 50% of the funding of the Space Shuttle mission came from the Pentagon. We forget the fact that there are entire Space Shuttle missions that are funded exclusively by the Pentagon to launch military satellites and to test Star Wars-type machinery in outer space. Therefore, it's not a surprise that the military is very much interested in perfecting plutonium power packs.
The next proposed U.S. launch of a nuclear-powered device is scheduled for 2003, when NASA wants to launch a plutonium-powered space probe called Europa to Europa, the moon of Jupiter. Yet also in 2003, the European Space Agency will be sending up its Rosetta space probe using high-efficiency solar cells to produce onboard power instead of plutonium, and Rosetta is to go beyond the orbit of Jupiter to rendezvous with the comet Wirtanen.
When you hear about the potential dangers of the militarization of outer space, there are several things that the average citizen can do. First, get informed. Go beyond the propaganda. Go beyond the mythology that we're simply exploring outer space to satisfy our scientific curiosity. Realize that one of the main engines behind this has been the Pentagon, which desires to use the high ground of outer space for its weaponry. And then, after you go beyond the propaganda, get active. Join an organization. Write to your congressman or congresswoman. Get politically active in order to make sure that social change is a byproduct of our education. And remember, it's just not you. It's your children. It's the environment. It's our future. Our future depends upon a space that is free of nuclear weapons, free of nuclear power plants. Our world depends upon an environment that is clean, healthy, and is for everyone, not just the multinational corporations.
Among U.S. public officials strongly against Star Wars is Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio. Here he is giving the keynote speech at the international meeting in Washington in 2000 of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space.
When we see the presence of so many thousands of our brothers and sisters in this Capitol today and tomorrow to protest the policies of the International Monetary Fund, which the structural adjustment policies, which are crushing people, countries around the world, which are making it impossible for them to have decent living conditions. When we see the World Bank being used as an institution that makes it even tougher for countries to be able to meet the needs of their population, I think that we can come to an understanding that this policy can only lead to more instability around the world. And what it should lead to, and what it must lead to, is a reawakening of a social consciousness in this country to challenge our fellow citizens to realize that we are creating the seeds of the destruction of people all over this world, and it inevitably will come back to this country as well. Because it is a moral issue. We're a country that should be about turning swords into plowshares, and that's what the ABM Treaty was about. Not in fashioning new, technologically superior swords to hold like swords of Damocles over the populations of the world. We cannot survive as a nation with that approach. We need to, as a nation, encourage our citizenry to be active citizens in changing the political process. And so what you need to do is to inspire people to recognize the potency of their own involvement, of their ability to make a difference, of the necessity of each person standing up and speaking out, of the necessity of us collectively challenging the policies at the ballot box and, if necessary, in the streets of this nation.
And I think what we really need to have is a new link, new intimate link between the environmental movement, the justice movement, and the peace movement.
United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, in opening the third UN Conference on Exploration and Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in 1999, declared, above all, we must guard against the misuse of outer space. We cannot view the expanse of space as another battleground for our earthly conflicts. This, however, is not the vision of the United States government. There must be strong opposition in the United States and international action to stop Star Wars, to prevent the heavens from being turned into a war zone. There needs to be global agreement banning all weapons in space. We must work, and we'll have to work fast and hard to keep space for peace. This has been Carl Grossman. Thanks for watching.
Hi, welcome back. This is Dead Air Live, and tonight's show is called Space Wars. We're talking about the militarization and possible weaponization of space. So in that video we just watched, Star Wars Returns, there were a couple of points that I feel like we can follow up on. One is the idea of the outer space treaties that were made several years ago, yes, to try and protect space from weaponization. Can you discuss how we might be violating that, or what those treaties?
Well, although the treaty does talk about the concept of having space preserved as a place of benefit to humankind, it only specifically prohibits countries from putting nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction into space. So at least there's sort of maybe a difference between the intent of the law and the law itself. The law itself, the treaty itself, would permit countries to put other kinds of weapons in space, laser weapons, or ordinary explosive weapons, or the kind of weapons that the U.S. is thinking about developing for its missile defense system, which don't have, basically just destroy a target by ramming into it at high speed. So under the terms of the Outer Space Treaty, those things are legal.
But, so that was the intent of the treaty?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the negotiating history. My guess is that there was not a consensus, which often happens when you negotiate treaties, and that there was an agreement that countries should not put nuclear weapons in space. I think in particular there was a concern once the Soviet Union flew its first satellite, Sputnik, that there had already been long-range missiles developed and nuclear weapons. This was the middle of the Cold War. People were worried about the possibility of putting a nuclear weapon into orbit. Mm-hmm. And that was probably the motivating factor that pushed them in that direction.
This was also 30 years ago when the only kind of weapon that people were thinking about that could be of use in space was a nuclear weapon. The technology has changed. Things like lasers and such are now, if not feasible, then at least you can talk about them without sounding like you're Buck Rogers. So that has changed, and the treaty has remained the same.
Should there be a new treaty?
I think that's a very, very interesting question, and I think there are two aspects. I mean, I think that it is time for the world to consider this, and I think it would be a good idea. There are two things that a treaty could cover that are different but related. One is this issue of weapons in space. What are you allowed to put into orbit up there? So far, countries put up spy satellites and other kinds of sensors that have military utility, but not things that can by themselves destroy something else. That would be a weapon. Mm-hmm. The other issue is whether you're allowed to shoot down things that are in space, even if you're doing so from the ground. Okay, and that is a relatively easy thing to do, unfortunately. I mean, the U.S. is having difficulties developing a missile defense system that can reliably shoot down a ballistic missile. By comparison, it's much easier to shoot down a satellite. It goes around in a predictable orbit, mm-hmm. and you can wait until you're ready. Mm-hmm. And so far, the U.S. and the Soviet Union developed technology to shoot down satellites, but never tested them and never deployed it. And so I think that would be a good thing to codify in a legal agreement, that this is not permitted.
But realistically, you have to say politically, when you look at what's happening with the Global Change Treaty, this week the bioweapons treaty the new protocol has gone down the tubes because the administration has pulled the plug on it and said the U.S. won't play. I think that politically it's impossible to imagine this administration in any way putting forward any kind of plan to ban satellite weapons. Right. The rest of the world can do what it wants. It can say, no, you can't do that. The U.S. almost certainly at this point will say no, and there will be no treaty.
Well, there is the precedent of the Landmines Treaty, where a lot of other countries went ahead and did what they thought they could and should do without the U.S. Mm-hmm. And that may be something that we'll see in the next few years. I don't know, but there is that precedent that it's true the U.S. is a major, major player in this field, and in some sense a treaty would not be all that valuable without the U.S. Right. On the other hand, I think the U.S. would also be hard-pressed to, in a sense, stand up to the rest of the world if it was clear that other countries really wanted this kind of a treaty. So I think, we have yet to see, but there are some countries, Canada, I think was mentioned in the video, and others who are strongly supportive of this idea of a treaty banning both weapons in space and shooting down satellites in space.
Let's take a minute to talk about Star Wars, because we're talking about reviving Star Wars. And now, Andrew, you said you did a lot of work in the early 80s reporting about Star Wars. Can you explain what Star Wars was and why it didn't work then, why it might work now?
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between missile defense and weapons in space, because they aren't necessarily the same. The idea of missile defense is very simple.
Star Wars.
Okay. Well, not necessarily Star Wars.
All right.
No?
I'm sorry.
See,
I just wanted to have you explain.
That's the name that it got back in the early 80s, because Reagan envisioned, and people who were advising him, like Ed Teller from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, who helped develop the H-bomb, the kind of model for Dr. Strangelove, they were pushing a space-based defense. In other words, you would have giant lasers in space, you shoot the enemy shoots a missile, and you have the satellite that's hovering, waiting. It could shoot down that missile before it can drop its weapon. That is one way of doing it. But there are other ways. You can do it. You can have a ground-based system. You can have an air-based system. You could have planes flying around that could try and shoot these things down. There are a lot of ways of stopping missiles, not just by putting them into space. So I think it's important to note that that's a whole issue that involves the ABM treaty, the treaty that is designed to prevent the U.S. and the Soviet Union from developing missile defenses in order to keep the balance of power. The issue of weapons in space is different. The military depends largely on space for communications, for command, for control, and for intelligence. These are vital. if the military were to lose, if the U.S. military were to lose those satellites, say during the Gulf War or during a similar war like that, it would really be up the creek. So the military has reasons to want to defend the systems that it has in place, which are very valuable now in its warfighting capabilities. So, and those are the issues that then would fall under the perhaps the Outer Space Treaty or other treaties that involve, or that's the only one that involve actual weapons in space. So they're two separate issues, and the issue of Star Wars, it didn't work because there was a lack of political support, terrible technical problems which suddenly popped up after these beautiful view graphs that they designed. They looked good, but to actually get this stuff into the air and into space turned out to be incredibly expensive and incredibly technically difficult.
Because they said it was like shooting a bullet with a bullet.
Right.
Yeah, although.
But now they
have shot
it.
a bullet with a bullet,
okay.
Actually.
So
it can be done.
What is different now that might use?
Well, I mean, one obvious technological advance you've had in 15 years is in computerization and in the ability to develop sophisticated algorithms and computer models which can model knocking out a missile rather than having to do an expensive and time-consuming test. So there are a lot of things. Technology has advanced in 15 years, which advocates will say will make it easier and cheaper to develop a system like this.
I would say actually that, I mean, to some extent that's right, although now the U.S. is actually focusing on a much more limited goal. And in fact, it is not currently envisioned as being a system that will have weapons in space. It is currently, under Clinton, what they were developing were interceptors that would be launched from the ground. Essentially, right. Missiles, ground-based missiles that would have on them a so-called kill vehicle that was designed to destroy an incoming warhead by smashing into it. And I mean, it's true technology has advanced because when the U.S. first designed a missile defense system back in the late 60s, the U.S. actually deployed one in the early 70s to protect our missile silos in North Dakota. They were armed with nuclear warheads, those interceptors, because the technology to get close enough to the incoming warhead just wasn't there. And so now, in what is really an amazing technical feat, they have basically hit what they call hit a bullet with a bullet, where the kill vehicle has hit a mock warhead. I mean, they have literally rammed into each other in outer space, and that is remarkable and it's necessary, but it's not nearly sufficient in order to build a missile defense system that can work. And what has always been true and what remains true is that because this is a defense system against nuclear weapons, you have to have very high levels of effectiveness to make it worthwhile. And the attacker, in some sense, it's technically much easier to foil this defense, which by its nature is a very complicated machine that has lots of pieces that all have to work together perfectly. And there are ways of even a country that is not nearly as sophisticated as the United States can fool or overwhelm the missile defense system that Clinton was designing and that President Bush is continuing with.
Is that, you were quoted in this New York Times article saying something about the countermeasures that are already in place. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, they're not already in place, but they're already, I mean, the idea, I, along with 10 other physicists and engineers last year, released a report, a rather lengthy report, looking at, called Countermeasures. It's on the Union of Concerned Scientists website. Basically it looked at the issue of if the missile defense system that President Clinton was proposing to build, if it was fully deployed with every sensor and every interceptor that they had planned for well beyond 2010, and there was a threat from, say, North Korea, a country had succeeded in building a long-range missile and a nuclear warhead to top it with, what else could it do? Technically, what else could it do, and what effect would that have on the missile defense system? And we looked at very simple ideas that are not new, in fact, are things the U.S. itself has thought about for 40 years, but we applied it to the situation. And one is basically takes advantage of the fact that the missile defense is designed to shoot down the warhead in outer space. In outer space, there's no air. and there's no air resistance. So heavy objects and lightweight objects travel on the same trajectory. You can't tell by looking at the motion whether it's heavy or light. And that opens up an opportunity for an attacker to have, to put a lot of very lightweight balloon decoys, for example, that would blow up once the missile released them with like a little thing that blows up the airbag in your car. And at the same time, you'd put a balloon around the warhead. And so instead of having one warhead to shoot at, the missile defense system might have 50 objects that all look slightly different, but there's not one that stands out. And then, you know, your limited missile defense system doesn't do you much good. So there are very simple, I mean, this has always been the problem in a sense, is steps the other side can take. It is not like flying to the moon. It's not like doing any of these things where it's just humans against nature, because there's another side that also has access to technology.
You mentioned your website, and I just want to take this opportunity. We can put up the website of both the Union of Concerned Scientists and Science Magazine for people who want to do more research. I want to make sure I got it right. It's ucs.usa.org?
No, it's just ucsusa.org.
Okay, so maybe we can correct that before putting it up. ucsusa.org. What about the nuclear reactors that they talked about in the video being out there?
Well, the only nuclear reactors that are out there right now, as far as I know, are primarily the NASA missions, which go into deep space. NASA would prefer, at least for PR reasons, not to have to launch these. But if you're going to study a distant planet that is far from the sun, solar power is not a very realistic option. If you want to get in close, you want to carry a lot of instruments that use a lot of power. So NASA has used these, what are called RTGs, which generate, essentially it's plutonium that generates electricity for the spacecraft. It's not a nuclear power plant per se. It's not a reactor. It's actually, but it does contain, a very deadly substance. So the concern is that upon launch when the spacecraft are often sent to Venus and then slingshot past Earth in order to pick up speed to make it out into the outer solar system, the concern is that there would be an accident of some sort, and that could cause a deadly release. This is, to me, a completely different issue. It's an important issue which needs to be debated and discussed, and certainly should not be shoved under the rug. But it has nothing to do with ballistic missile defense. Or with anti-satellite weapons, as far as I can tell. I think to lump that in confuses the issue, and I think a person loses credibility to discuss that as in the same breath with these other issues, which have to do with international treaties and military posture as opposed to outer space exploration. It certainly would be good if we can come up with alternative ways of powering spacecraft, and I'm sure that could happen if the money were invested.
Yeah, the nuclear reactors that they were talking about that would be needed to power these lasers in space would be a nuclear reactor. And that is, I mean, very far off in the future, if at all. That is a completely different thing from what he was talking about with respect to powering space that's not a nuclear reactor.
Okay. I want to get some closing comments from you, but I also want to just ask you about your thoughts about the useful technologies that are in space right now. I mean, there's all these satellites, and I think it's very interesting that there's a lot of things that we do in our daily lives that satellites are responsible for, that we don't even really know or understand. And in this New York Times article, they were mentioning that we use space satellites for ATMs and credit card transactions and the internet. And can you explain this just in layman's terms briefly before we wrap this up? I'm just very curious.
Well, I think the basic point is just that a lot of these communications networks rely on satellites, and if one satellite goes out, then you've lost, the connection. I don't think it's any more complicated than that. Although I do think that this, in a sense, presents an opportunity for people who are interested in getting a treaty prohibiting weapons in space and prohibiting anti-satellite weapons, is that there are large commercial interests who would prefer not to have space weaponized. So on the one hand, there are some commercial interests that clearly have an interest in it, but I would say that because satellite technology is so widespread and the use will only increase over time, there are large commercial interests in this country and Europe, Japan and elsewhere that it's in their interest to prevent this kind of thing.
Because their business is relying on it, and
That's
it
right.
could endanger their satellite.
Absolutely.
Or lock them out.
And just imagine, you know, they have to insure their satellites. I mean, think about how much more that would cost if there's a danger that another country could shoot them down at will.
So you really have three industries that have grown up around space, which actually grow out of the militarization of space. One are the telecommunication satellites, which we now depend upon so much for voice and for data, et cetera. Then we have global positioning satellites, which was originally called Navstar, Navy Star. It was actually a Navy system that was put up purely for military purposes to tell the Navy where their ships were. And that has grown into, you know, something that has enormous applications which nobody would have dreamed of 10 or 20 years ago in terms of rescuing people. You know, if you don't know where you are now, GPS can tell you where you are. The applications are really quite marvelous. And then a third industry, which is just beginning to grow, is space imaging. Being able to use images from space for city planning, to follow pollutants. I mean, from an environmental point of view, they're a real boon. And those come directly out of military technology in spy satellites. So, you know, those are three areas that I think are quite worthwhile noting, and I think that Elizabeth is right that these are all industries that have a real interest in keeping space as safe as possible.
And what about individual citizens? I mean, we have 1 minute left. Any suggestions, or I mean, they were saying write your congressman about your concerns.
That is a very, very good idea. It is. It matters, especially if you write. They care.
Any projections on what might happen in the Bush administration?
Well, I don't think. You know, I mean, I could say, you know, you're not going to see any new international treaty. I think that's pretty clear.
Yes. No. Certainly, the Bush administration will not push something like that. I think we won't see much of. I mean, you know, a lot of these things are quite a ways in the future. So I think, in some sense, the good news is we might not see much.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming in the studio tonight, and thank you all for watching. I hope this has been an educational experience. It has for me. So, for Dead Air Live, good night.